I think we ought to begin. My name is Michael Ranieri. For those of you who did not attend the last presentation or who I haven't met before. Now today I'm going to talk about Hui, and it is Hui, not Hui, and Da Nang. But before, if you don't mind, I'd like to just hit a few topics that have come up since my last talk and what arose from discussions I had on the boat yesterday or while we were walking around the streets of Hanoi. First question, the gentleman came up to me and he said, it looks to me, Mike, that Hanoi is doing pretty well. Looks pretty capitalistic. And am I right? And I can honestly say that he was. And from my perspective, I have never seen Hanoi bustling the way it is and that mayhem on the streets. In previous trips, you would see the cyclo, you know, that bicycle type contraption with a couple of seats at the back. I saw maybe one the other day. You just don't see them like you did in the past because there are so many more motorcycles on the road. There's so many more cars on the road. So things are changing, and I think for the better in Hanoi and around the country. You see more private enterprise. All those shops that you saw today or the other day, all owned privately. Yes, it's a state-controlled economy. Yes, state enterprises dominate, but more and more private enterprise is taking place in Hanoi and around the country. Another question which was raised at the last presentation was about landmines in Vietnam. And I can't tell you how many landmines, and I didn't quite understand the question the other day. But yes, the Vietnamese are working with the U.S. government to try to identify landmines. Most of these landmines that are still around are in the 6 central provinces, the central part of the country. Much of these landmines have been covered up by deep forestation, so they're hard to identify with dogs or however, but they're making an attempt to do so. And the Vietnamese estimate roughly 40,000 people have been killed since 1975 because of landmines. People are dying and being maimed still to this day because of their stepping on these landmines. So that's reparation. The next one has to do with reparations. A good question was asked of me after the Americans lost the war, if I could put it that way, after the Vietnam War, or as the Vietnamese say, the American War. It was discussed at the Paris Accords in 1973. Kissinger, Secretary of State Kissinger at the time, and President Nixon secretly agreed to, they didn't want to call it reparations, they didn't want to call it war damages, but aid of $3.3 billion. But that aid has never been given as reparations or as war damages to this day. The reason is, basically from the U.S. perspective, that the Vietnamese, for the longest, for a long period of time, weren't providing enough information about the MIAs, those Americans that were missing in action. And from the Vietnamese perspective, maybe they weren't as cooperative as they needed to be, or didn't provide enough information about the MIAs because they wanted relations with the U.S. So this issue kept bubbling around, and we didn't provide aid and not damage relief until around 1987. Okay. Now, a couple of other questions, again, before I get into the body of my presentation. Hong Kiem. We walked around Hong Kiem, right, the other day. That's that lake. And people asked, well, you know, is it always like this? And this is kind of related to the first issue I raised. No, it doesn't always look like that because of all the flowers we saw. And that's because of the Chinese New Year, or Tet, or not Chinese New Year, Lunar New Year, and that's Tet. Again, Tet, someone asked a question about Tet. What does Tet mean? Or what is Tet? T-E-T, right? That word, and thanks to my wife and I, we did a little research about that word. That actual word is meaning holiday. But when the Vietnamese use it, it's in combination with two other words, again, which means Lunar New Year holiday. Right? And that word was picked up on when that great offensive took place in 1968, the attack on Hue and the rest of the country here, and it was called the Tet Offensive. It happened during actually on the Lunar New Year, and the attacks occurred all across the country. So again, I hope you don't mind, I just thought I would mention these issues that have been percolating for the last couple of days. All right, as I am want to do, I'd like to mention a few things before we take a closer look at the map of Vietnam. First of all, I think it's a great idea. We are going to Hue, or it's part of the itinerary that's been put together, because not to go to Hue would be like going to Japan and not going to Kyoto, right? Or going to Paris and not going to Versailles. Maybe going to Beijing, China, and not going to Xi'an and seeing the terracotta figures. It's a very important part of Vietnamese history. It plays an important role in Vietnamese history, Hue, and there's a lot to see in this city. Again, Hue, we don't have the previous slide, but it was the imperial capital from 1802 to 1945. Now, 1945 was the day that Bao Dai, the Emperor Bao Dai, abdicated. Now, I want to mention this right up front because, again, it relates to what we heard, many of us heard, from our tour guides the other day. And now they made a big thing, I think, when we went to the imperial, well, not imperial, the presidential palace, and they talked glowingly of Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho, and how he came from a very, well, actually his parentage was, his father was a scholar, but a very simple background. He led a very simple life, and our tour guides went on and on about the way in which he led his life. He was a bachelor, so on and so forth. It's kind of a veiled attempt, I think, when they talked about Ho in this way, because he was the antithesis of what Bao Dai was all about, who the French backed, who the Americans backed at various stages. And this Emperor Bao Dai, he would be seen about Hue and where in Europe when he was there for a time, with golf shoes, sunglasses. In 1949, when they wanted to bring him back to Vietnam, the French, that is, where was he? He was at the French Riviera. He was, you know, the gambling at racetracks. So again, very different from the kind of life that Ho Chi Minh led. And so they always like to contrast these two characters in Vietnamese history. Now, Bao Dai actually, after abdicating, he was in charge of the state, South Vietnam, for a period of time. But again, you might want to keep that in mind when you hear about Ho Chi Minh and what was going on here. Now, it's a logical place, Hue, a logical place to have Hue as the capital of Vietnam, or have it the imperial capital there, because it's so centrally located. However, maybe we could flip to the map a second, Joyce, if we can. Yeah, there it is. Now, Hue is closer, actually, to Hanoi than it is to Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon. But when the Geneva Accords took place, it was the dividing line between North Vietnam and South Vietnam was at the 17th parallel, and that placed Hue in the south rather than the north. But I could tell you, I mean, all the literature that you read about Hue and the offensive which took place in 1968, the North Vietnamese, really, Hue was a thorn in their side. It was a place which they often described as reactionary, very feudal. So when they bombarded Hue, which was a departure from the kind of hit-and-run strategy or guerrilla strategy that the North Vietnamese had, they were very brutal. And when the Americans tried to win back Hue, after a week or so in which it was under North Vietnamese control, I mean, there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. It was really a difficult fight, and but from our perspective, it was a very big cycle, and we basically did win back Hue. It was a psychological blow, because most people feel from that time on, the Americans lost their appetite, as it were, for continuing the war. And so Hue plays a very important part in American and Vietnamese war history. And often, and again, according to literature, it's a wonder that neither the Americans at the time, which had hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam, why wasn't Hue, or Da Nang for that matter, better fortified? It's kind of a mystery to everybody why it wasn't, and why the Vietnamese were as successful as they were. And the city, by the way, suffered a great deal. A lot of damage was done to the city, but fortunately there's still enough to see for us. And again, like I said, I think it's a very good idea that we'll be going. Okay, just to pick up a little bit on what we talked about last time that we were here, or that I gave the presentation. The moving of Hue, moving the capital to Hue, resulted or followed this rebellion, this internal rebellion that was taking place inside the country. Now, I don't want to go over, I mentioned Jia Long last time, okay? He was the first emperor of the Wen dynasty, of which this Bao Dai I just talked about was the last, or the 13th emperor of Vietnam. But the important thing and really, he did usher in a period of stability in Vietnam. However, most historians feel that this time was when the Vietnamese really began to protest against protest against the Chinese influence. Why? Because the Chinese were taking sides in the rebellions that were going on. So a lot of nationalistic sentiment started to grow within Vietnam. So again, most people feel that the seeds of a revolutionary fervor that Ho Chi Minh and his followers picked up on started around this point. Right? And but interestingly enough, that Jia Long and his successors were still very interested in Confucianism. Right? This is Jia Long. That's an interesting one. The next slide, maybe, Joyce. This is why and we'll see this if you visit Hue, that this walled palace or forbidden city inside the citadel that was more of French influence actually was based on the forbidden city in Peking. And also the tombs that many of us will be visiting, also modeled after the tombs in China. So on the one hand, like I said the last time, you had China as kind of a blessing in Vietnamese history. It was also a curse. I mean, they really hated the idea of being dominated by the Chinese, but they would copy quite a bit from the Chinese. Also, another thing I wanted to mention about the Vietnamese language. Joyce and I, my wife and I, were often amazed at how many words we could pick up from Vietnamese when they're talking, how many Chinese words all the time. So there's a lot of Chinese influence in the language today. There's Khmer influence in the language. There's a little Thai, Hmong influence, which is another ethnic group within Vietnam, Khmer influence. So it's a language which incorporates a lot of different strains. Now, at the same time, the Vietnamese were trying to copy whatever they could from the Chinese. There was this clash of cultures taking place because Jiao Long and his successors, Minh Mang was Jiao Long's son. This was at a time when you had more influence from the West. Now, there is some kind of discussion that goes in within the scholarly circles, if you will, about just how much this Minh Mang wanted Western ideas or wanted trade with the West. Some people say that he didn't want nothing to do with the French or nothing to do with Western powers, but more and more evidence is surfacing that while he didn't want to trade so much, he did want Western techniques in weaponry, navigation as such. So again, but there was this reluctance to get too involved with Western powers, which is interesting from my perspective because I spend a lot of time studying what goes on in China. Minh Mang was very critical of the Chinese because the way in which China dealt with foreigners is that, well, listen, we really don't want these foreigners involved in our country. Well, we'll give them, they want a concession? Okay, we'll give them a little concession in Shanghai, whether it's the French concession, the British or American concession, this little territory within Shanghai. And then this way we have the rest of the country that we'll deal with and the rest of the Chinese people. Minh Mang said, this is crazy. You just got to get rid of these foreigners to have as little to do with them as possible. Even, by the way, some people asked me on the trip about Hong Kong. And, you know, why was it possible that the British were able to see Hong Kong ceded to them in perpetuity? Well, the Chinese thought there's a barren island. You know, what do we need? And maybe, what do we need this for? We'll give them this crumb, and maybe that's the last we'll see of the British. That was kind of the mentality. Again, totally different than the Vietnamese at this stage. Right? They also were very disappointed. They were very upset with the French because during this period they were not only converting a lot of people to Catholicism, but they were taking sides in some of the revolts, the internal revolts that were taking place. And as the slide says, 300,000 Catholic converts. You might want to keep this in mind because roughly, it's estimated that roughly 1 million Catholics from the north fled to the south during, after 1954. And then ultimately many of those Catholics became some of the boat people that so many of which went to Australia. In Hong Kong, when we got to Hong Kong in 1986, there were camps full of these boat people. Like I said, many of whom were Catholics or simply businessmen that thought that or in fact saw their possessions taken away, so fled the country. So at that time there were 300,000, and it grew substantially after that Catholic population. And like I said, they were mistreated in the north, and many did flee. If you don't mind, I have something very interesting. Again, I'm not trying to take sides or anything, but I have a quote, if I can find it here, from Desmond Tutu about, let me see if I can find it. Okay. He was referring to Africa, but I think the same can be said about Asia, and particularly Vietnam. He says, when the white missionaries came to Africa, let us read Asia, they had the Bible and we had the land, right? They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. I mean, I'm very well said. And again, this did not escape Ho Chi Minh and his followers in the latter part of the 19th century. Okay. Thank you. Yes, please. Historical monuments all over Hue, and many of these monuments, which we will see, they got started during this period, starting in the early 19th century. Actually, most of them are done within the 19th century. I'll just mention one. I mean, the tombs you will see and so on. But I'd like to mention Tien Mu Pagoda, which is the official symbol. This one. We should see this one. This is what they call the official symbol of the city. It's the largest pagoda in Hue. Each floor is dedicated to a different Buddhism, a different strain of Buddhism. And Joyce, my wife, reminded me today, it's also to this Tien Mu god, or Buddha, if you will, in which many seamen pray to or look for solace from, Tien Mu. Now, I'd also like to mention this last hotbed of Buddhist protest. At the time of the Vietnam War, and even today, Buddhism flourishes in Hue. But I don't know if some of you, I'm sure some of you might remember that we saw in the press, on TV, the self-immolation of the monk, remember, on the streets of Saigon? And that really, I think, galvanized either support for or a condemnation of what was going on. But that monk was from Hue. Okay? So again, this was a hotbed of Buddhist protest. Now, what was that monk protesting? It was what they perceived to be slights against Buddhism and a favoritism toward Catholicism that was in place in South Vietnam. Remember, Hue was part of South Vietnam, right? And they felt that the government in South Vietnam, backed by the French and then by the Americans, were too pro-Catholic, if you will. Yes, they were anti-communists, but they did not support Buddhism the way they felt it should have been supported. They felt discriminated against. Okay? So it wasn't so much a protest against the war as such, but it was a protest against the government in Saigon at the time. Okay? Now, the French-style buildings that we will see, by the way, this Perfume River separates north and south. There you go. Look how lush Hue is. It's really very green, very lush. And also on this south side, you will see, I don't think, do we have a slide of that? Yeah. The oldest school in Vietnam, built by the French. There you go. You can see the French architecture there. Very distinctive. I find the color kind of interesting. You remember here, or in Hanoi, yellow buildings. Every time you see a yellow building around that presidential palace, they were all French-style buildings. Here, of course, different color. Also, speaking of color, purple is big in Hue. An imperial city, imperial capital for a long time. Purple was worn at the court level. So you'll see many ladies, and of course the Aodai, you know, that pretty costume that ladies wear, the pants and the longest kind of jacket. Many will wear purple, again, which was a color of reverence, a color worn at the court. So many people in Hue like to wear the purple color, especially, like I said, these ladies. By the way, that's the other thing. I don't know if you picked up on it in our travels in Hanoi. You don't see too many people in Hanoi, or the ladies, wearing that traditional costume. That's also a change. When I first started coming here in the 90s, you saw many more women wearing that outfit. And you will see many more wearing it in the South and Hue. But I was surprised that in Hanoi we didn't see more of that. I also, by the way, was surprised at just how well people dressed or are dressing these days. But someone said, well, I noticed they dye their hair, but I don't see many tattoos. You know, I guess that hasn't quite got here yet. Again, I don't want to get too much into this. We'll cover some of the historical dynamics of the war. I felt it fits better when we talk about, or when I make my presentation having to do with Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, which was the seat that was the capital of South Vietnam from 1954 to when it was liberated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. I mentioned that Emperor Bao Dai abdicated at Hue, and he actually handed over power to Ho Chi Minh. But again, like I mentioned the other day, this power did not last long because the French decided they wanted to come back and they wanted to keep Vietnam as a colony of theirs. But in any case, eventually what happened, we had a communist government in Hanoi, and we had the new capital of Saigon in the south. I mentioned, I don't have to go back over the Tet Offensive, Joyce, the next time. It was a site of very bloody battles. It was captured. It was a major city captured by the Vietnamese, and it was under control of the Army of the Republic, it's called ARVN, the Army of the Republic of the Vietnamese, and it was controlled by the Americans. And yet, the Northerners were able to attack and capture the city, and it really did, it was a psychological blow. A lot of damaged landscape and buildings, I already mentioned. What about Hue today? As what should be obvious to you, it's the tourism dollars that really drive the economy of Hue. And I think, and I'm sure you saw as much when you were in Hanoi, the government is doing a very good job, I think, in attracting tourists to the country. Halong Bay, when I first started coming here, wasn't organized the way it is today. And certainly you didn't see as many tourists coming through. You looked at the presidential palace, right? How nicely manicured the grounds are at the palace or in that area. I thought the city looked much better. Certainly when I first started coming, there wasn't any Gucci or Prada or anything like that. So, I mean, but basically they're doing what they can. They made sure, by the way, very early on, that UNESCO got in here and identified these sites as World Heritage Sites. They've done a very good, and they've kept up these sites, I think, pretty well. Again, you saw that slide with the lakes, the canals, the lush vegetation. Population about 350,000. Pretty good size city. Okay, that's Hue. I'm going to move real quick now. So if you have any questions, if you could just about Hue, we'll cover that after I spend a few minutes talking about Da Nang. Okay? Why talk about Da Nang? Anybody? What's so important about Da Nang? Right. It was a major naval base, air base, anything else? Industrial port, but also it's home of the Chams. You remember when we talked last time about all the different influences in Vietnam? We talked about this being part of India, China. So we had a major influence from India and a major influence from China. Well, the Indian influence that we talk about, that we see in the sculpture and the architecture and such, really stems from this period, the Cham period. Now, by the way, there are still some Chams living in Vietnam, in the central part, and these are people that are ethnically and linguistically different than the Viet people, the Vietnamese people. Right? And again, they received most of their, not received, but they were very influenced by Indian scholars, pilgrims that settled or visited that part of the country, the south central coast. Okay? And that's why, by the way, I encourage people to visit the Cham Museum in Da Nang, where you can see just what kind of impact that they had on this region. These Cham people, by the way, were not agriculturally based. They were seafaring people, and they made their money by basically exploiting neighboring countries and communities. Da Nang, that word, is a Cham word, which means, or it's said in Cham, Danak, D-A and then N-A-K, which means opening of a large river. And the river they're talking about is the Han River. So the Vietnamese, Da Nang, is an adaptation of this Cham word. In French, it's Touraine. It was identified or renamed Touraine by the French. I talked a little bit about this last time. Okay, we can go to the